Well, good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending upon which time zone you're in. Welcome to this GMF on Turkey conversation. I'm Ian Lesser from GMF here in Brussels, and thank you very, very much for joining us today. This series, just to say a word at the outset, this series is meant to, well, as it says, continue the conversation around our On Turkey Papers series, which continues to be extremely active. And under the conditions that we have today, we thought it was doubly important to be able to have a format where people could come together, at least virtually, to discuss with the author and others some of the most important issues concerning Turkey, its Western relationships, the region, and other issues. And I think you'll agree that under the conditions we have now with COVID, it's very, very difficult to get attention to almost anything but this crisis for understandable reasons. But truly, there are a lot of things happening in the world that are important, challenging, potentially very risky for transatlantic partners that we need to be talking about as well. So this is one very good format for us to do that. And just to say a big thank you to Özgür and Ceylan in our Ankara office, and thank you for the opportunity to be able to moderate the conversation today. It's really a pleasure. So today we have with us Şaban Kardaş, who has written really a very provocative, very interesting on Turkey piece talking about Turkey's Mission Impossible. It's a good title, Turkey's Mission Impossible in Idlib. And so we've asked him to say a few words, sort of summarizing his thinking on the question, and then we'll have a conversation. And we're going to be joined by two others. We have two other wonderful people with us here today. Outzen, who is the Senior Advisor for for Syria engagement, although I think a lot of it does turn out to be Turkey engagement at the US Department of State, and also Dorothée Schmid, who heads the Middle East program at IFRI in Paris. So thanks to all of you for joining us. I've asked them, well, first to have Şaban say a few words, and then we'll come in turn, maybe to Rich first, and then we'll just open it up for a conversation, and then also, of course, to all of you, just to say this is on the record, and if you would like to put a question in the queue, there is a function where you can do that, and we'll keep track of those things, and we'll get to as many of you as we can. So thank you again. Şaban, let me turn to you maybe to say a few words about some of the key themes of the paper and the important points as you see them. Thanks again.
Thank you, Ian, and good morning or good afternoon to everybody, wherever you are based on. And then let me briefly recapitulate a few points from the paper so that we can further expand on those ideas during the Q&A, as well as based on the contributions from the other panelists. I mean, the subtitle was Unstable Equilibrium. So the Mission Impossible was about maintaining what I termed as unstable equilibrium in Idlib, which was formed a couple of years back, roughly around 2017. So Idlib, as a result of the transformation of the Syrian conflict, came to be one of the cornerstones, one of the most critical elements of Turkey's Syria policy. And since then, managing the Idlib situation has been a big burden on Turkey's Syria policy. So Turkey has assumed a big responsibility in terms of shouldering the humanitarian costs in Idlib, in terms of also undertaking some new geopolitical alignments, some new deals with other stakeholders. My argument is that the so-called Astana process between Turkey, Russia, and Iran was very important, and one reason why Turkey had to enter into such a process with two of its rivals on the ground. They were not the partners. Both Russia and Iran were supporting the opposite sides in the Syrian crisis, mainly the Syrian regime. But despite that, Turkey had to develop a certain security mechanism, a certain confidence building mechanism And in my understanding, at the very outset of the Astana process, the main driver behind Turkey's rapprochement with these powers was managing the Idlib situation. So as you will remember, it was about 4 deconflicting zones originally. All 3 of them were later eliminated by the regime. The regime didn't keep to the Astana, but despite all 3 being eliminated, Turkey still kept talking about the Astana spirit, Astana process. That's also important to underline how much Idlib was at the core of Turkey's rapprochement with these powers in the context of Astana. And the reasons are obvious, as I also briefly stated in the paper. The potential refugee outflows from Idlib would have created a lot of damaging consequences, but it was not just about the outflow of millions of civilians, but potentially all the dangerous remaining radicals that were evacuated from other parts of Syria and sent to Idlib. So it has become the hotbed of all these radical elements, as well as a big number of civilians, IDPs from other parts of Syria. So keeping Idlib was important in that respect because of the refugee angle. It would also cut into Turkey-EU relations, so on and so forth. But also, I think, symbolically and also politically, it was important to maintain the position that Turkey's Syria policy hasn't failed, in the sense that Idlib remained the last bastion of the Syrian opposition, the so-called Syrian revolution. From the very end, the self-governing mechanisms there represented the spirit of the original Syrian revolution. So in that sense, keeping that experiment alive also had other symbolic and as well as political meanings. Keeping the opposition there as an intact entity and giving them a space at the diplomatic negotiation table, I think they were also part of Turkish calculations. But later, in the last few years, as a result of the Turkish military operations since 2016, Turkey created different enclaves based on different military operations. So as a result, increasingly, we can talk about a line of Turkish-controlled Syrian territories in the north. So now in the recent context, increasingly, the Turkish strategic thinking started to assume or argue that if Idlib falls, other Turkish enclaves would also fall. So in a sense, the Idlib became the kind of the first stone in the dominoes. So in order to maintain and sustain Turkish presence in different parts of northern Syria, you had to keep Idlib as well. As a result, the strategic importance attached to Idlib grew even further. So this was the background, and over time, the concern to keep Idlib, by keeping Idlib, what I mean is maintain the opposition control there, was a central part of Turkey's Syria policy. It led to the unstable equilibrium, by which I mean the following. So maintaining the equilibrium was achieved only as a result of very temporary transitionary deals. And once the equilibrium was disrupted, it was impossible to go back. So it's a kind of moving sand analogy in the sense that you always have to redefine the equilibrium if it is moved. So the concern is always to keep it there, but once it is out of its original position, it is difficult to get back. So this creates a kind of repetitive pattern from the Russian point of view, also from the regime point of view. Since 2018, we have seen different instances where the regime will push a bit and achieve some territorial gains, and Russia will support the regime directly or indirectly, especially through air power. And as a result, there will be a risk of escalation. Russia will step in, mediate a new ceasefire, so on and so forth. But in the meantime, as I said, impossible to get back to the original position. So Turkey would concede to the territorial losses of the opposition and the gains of the regime. So that was creating a certain pattern. But by entering into such an arrangement with Russia, accepting the Russian mediation, Turkey's main motivation was to buy some time. at the same time, this was the obligation on Turkey put by its Astana partners, which was to transform the internal scene in Idlib in the sense that the unwanted elements, HTS and other radical groups which were listed as terrorists by the United Nations, and also some other Salafi jihadist groups, some foreign fighters, many of them also local Syrian militants. Turkey's responsibility was to handle that situation. So that created this very unstable pattern, and we have been going through different phases until the recent escalation. So I think in the recent escalation, there were a couple of game changers which triggered Turkey's direct military involvement. Before, as part of the Astana and later Sochi deals, Turkey ended up establishing some observation points, but their mission was to observe jointly with Russia the ceasefire arrangements in place. But now in the recent crisis, what we have seen, Turkey had to initiate a military operation, deploy combat units, later use its air assets, and also mobilize quite a big amount of mechanized units, so on and so forth. So it changed the entire nature of the previous pattern in the sense that it dragged Turkey further into the Idlib quagmire. So I think it was because of the game changers, as I was arguing in the paper. Very briefly, on the one hand, regarding the regime and opposition dynamics, the regime advance earlier this year was faster than many had predicted. So there was a accepted argument that the opposition would hold the ground, they will put a big resistance, and the regime will not find it easy to advance on the ground. But suddenly, especially with the fall of the town of Sarakip, there was a kind of negative momentum on the side of the opposition forces, which put the risk, especially the city center, Idlib city center, under a big risk, in the sense that if the regime would rapidly advance into Idlib city center, it may have created the unwanted scenario where millions of, hundreds of thousands of people may be on the run. So to prevent it, Turkey acted. On the other hand, there is another major game changer about the Turkish strategic thinking, which I also referred to earlier, in the sense that boots on the ground matter kind of narrative came to shape Turkish policy. Sort of glorification of the use of force. We have seen it in previous operations vis-a-vis the YPG, PKK, getting some concessions from other counterparts, changing the calculus by inserting your own military force into the equation. That kind of thinking reflected, and still we hear similar arguments, sort of an escalation dominance narrative was shaping the Turkish policy. As a result, the thinking was that if we insert military force, we can change the calculus. And then as a result, we have seen the Turkish initial support for the opposition, but later Turkey had to upgrade this support into a self-standing military operation, which still goes on. And suddenly everybody was saying, well, we are very close to a direct interstate war between Turkey and Syria, dragging even Russia. And many people argued that the levers were not there anymore. Russia break wouldn't work. And then many also did argue in that particular window of opportunity that Turkey may use that window to remake its relationship with the West, with the United States, repair the troubled relationship on the axis of a kind of anti-regime, anti-Russia position. Despite such predictions, at the end of the day, we had the Moscow deal as a result of the meeting of the presidents in Moscow. Again, Russian mediation did work this time. It produced a ceasefire. But at the same time, we have seen that President Erdoğan also openly expressed it. The kind of American assistance, whatever it may have been, was not there. At least was not up to Turkey's expectations in that particular juncture. As a result, while we were moving away from the previous pattern of unstable escalation, we were back to the same pattern. Russian support to the regime military advance, Turkey is alarmed, EU is alarmed, everybody is alarmed, suddenly Russia steps in and brokers a deal. That pattern is repeated. Now we are standing at a very critical juncture. As I said, the time pressure is big on Turkey, but also the nature of the crisis has also transformed such that we have the same number of people in a shorter perimeter to Turkish border in a narrower space. So the nature of the problem remains at a very narrower space under bigger time constraints. And this is what I call the continuation of the mission impossible, so to speak. So the challenge now is Turkey has to stick with the deal, which is more about clearing the highways, as we have seen recently, the joint patrols with the Russians. But there is a big pressure on Turkey, but everything comes down to the question of transforming the internal scene in Idlib, transforming the internal scene, by which I mean how to handle the HTS and other radicals, so that the current deal, the current lines of control remain permanent. So I think at this point, Turkey is in a situation where it cannot tolerate any further regime advance, because it will put Idlib city center under a big threat. And as a result, we will see a huge exodus of people, and eventually the remaining people will be just gathering along the Turkish border. And this may create a kind of Gaza scenario, in the sense that you will have a huge refugee camp along the Turkey-Syria border. Continuation of this current lines of opposition control is important, because at least in the current situation, you have kind of some sort of a normal life going on. There is some self-governing mechanism. People are engaged in their daily activities. So it is not it is a burden on the international community to sustain Idlib. But if the Idlib city center falls and everybody is on the border in a huge refugee camp, it is gonna be a big pressure on not only Turkey, but also other international actors. I think this is what drives Turkey's policy, to prevent sort of a Gaza scenario at this stage, to prevent the fall of Idlib city center, for which it has indicated it is willingness. So two elements of deterrence before I finish. The intention and capability, as we always teach to our students in classes. Intention and capability are what you need for credible deterrence. So at this stage, this was the implicit assumption in my paper, that Turkey has, during the course of the escalation in February, mobilized an important amount of military muscle into Idlib, and since then it continued to do so, especially also about air denial capabilities. So with that, there is capability to deter, and I also think there is also intention to deter further regime advances, but also the challenge is about the internal makeup. So the Russian side seems to have given the additional extra time, buying the time metaphor I used in the paper, for Turkey to handle Idlib internally. But then the critical question is whether Turkey will use the same deterrent capability vis-a-vis the radicals inside. So this remains the big main challenge at this point in time. And as we have seen in the patrols, so on and so forth, there are provocations which Turkish army is currently handling very delicately. At this point, let me stop, and we can come back to it later, I guess.
Okay, no, Şaban, thank you very much for that. I mean, it was a real tour d'horizon of how you see yourself, the situation having evolved, but you also leave us with some rather disturbing open questions, which I think you would agree. I mean, not least of which is the open account with Syria and with Russia, because obviously Syria is not going to give up on consolidating the rest of its territorial gains. At some point, this is going to come to they're going to try to bring this to a closure. and what is Turkey's exit strategy, long-term exit strategy. But anyway, these are exactly the things we can come back to, of course. Rich, I'm going to come to you perhaps next to talk a little bit about, well, your reactions to this, but also, from an American perspective, what we've been trying to achieve and how successful do you think we've been.
Great. Thank you, Ian. And
over to you, Rich.
Şaban, that was fantastic. Thank you. I appreciated the excellent lay down there, as well as a very excellent paper. Just a couple quick comments on the paper. First of all, it frequently happens that I see a headline that catches my attention either negatively or positively, and then read the story and say, well, that's not exactly what he was saying. Mission Impossible, to me, is not exactly what you're saying in the article. What struck me in the article is that actually it's mission possible. That Turkey realized by putting boots in the ground and by reinstalling or installing the elements of deterrence that you discussed, that it could actually stop what looked like an inexorable regime advance and the victory narrative of the Assad regime. And in terms of it being unsustainable, we are replete in this century with examples of unsustainable status quo situations that have actually remained that way for quite some time. We've been in Afghanistan in an unsustainable status quo since 2002, late 2002, I guess. We have been, the Israelis have been in the Golan for quite a bit longer. They stayed in southern Lebanon for 18 years. It frequently happens that countries with security concerns get into these unsustainable situations, but sustain them for 20 years or so. I'm not saying that that's a direct parallel for what Turkey's going through, but having made the decision that it can get some effects on the ground through boots on the ground, I think what we're looking at is something more than unsustainable, but less than a permanent solution for sure. I think you've really latched onto something important here with this shift in Turkish strategic thinking, having spent 5 or 6 years hand-wringing really about what was going on the ground and handled it very indirectly when Turkey started this series of operations with Euphrates Shield and then Olive Branch and Peace Spring and the operation in Idlib now. It has an opportunity to change some dynamics on the ground. That can be for ill or for good. If the original vision of the Idlib ceasefires, which was to reduce the role that the radicals play and to find some solution that protects the civilians while meeting minimums for both the combatant parties, which means M4, M5 open to some sort of traffic, but not under the regime control necessarily. And the HTS thing is interesting from a US perspective because we have real concerns about extremist groups, Al-Qaeda linked and ISIS and so forth. And the possibility of, due to Turkish military presence, controlled by more moderate forces and perhaps dilution of and ultimately splitting off of HTS radical elements and potentially controlled by more moderate groups in Idlib is a tantalizing possibility. We have concerns without any real presence on the ground there, so we're watching to see how that evolves. And the last thing I'd say on the paper is only element I saw missing, and it's a small quibble, but something that needs to be taken into account, is regime weakness. Sometimes we have a tendency, and you talked about the Astana group, to think of the Idlib equation in terms of the Astana guarantors and the opposition only, but the regime obviously plays a role. I think the regime was actually far more anxious to get into a fight in Idlib starting in December, January, February than necessarily its Russian sponsors were. But regime weakness is a reality. The Turkish military showed that. The new turn in drone warfare that we saw inflicted severe damage on Assad's forces. Now, the Russians have tried to make good on that through provision of much more advanced equipment in the last month or 6 weeks or so. But trying to calculate the course of what's going to happen in Idlib without accounting for the fact that it's been proven that the Turks, at a time when they were not ready for a major escalation in February, bloodied the nose of the regime forces quite capably. And I think demonstrated that for the most part, the Russians will not directly confront them. They will not do airstrikes into Turkey. They're not going to, except for the one incident, of course, with very bad impacts in terms of Turkish casualties, for the most part, will not directly confront the Turks, presents the regime with another dilemma. So anyway, I thought it was a fantastic piece and a really good update of where we're at. Now, from a US perspective, I'm reminded of the Nasruddin Hoxha story when I think about Idlib. You know, the one where he's going to be executed by the Sultan then he says, well, it's a shame, Sultan, because I know how much you love your Arabian horse, and I was just on the cusp of this breakthrough where I was going to teach the horse how to speak. And then you and your horse would be able to reach new levels of rider and horse accomplishment. And so the Sultan says, okay, well, so I'm not going to execute you for the thing that you're guilty of, but you've got a year. So Nasruddin Hoxha is going home, and his wife, of course, berates him and says, you can't teach a horse how to talk. Unsustainable equilibrium, I suppose. And he says, well, look, I've got a year. And in that year, maybe the horse dies, maybe the Sultan dies, or maybe the horse learns how to talk. So this is where we're at in Idlib. There are no clear and good solutions, but buying time in the way that Turkey has accomplishes what Nasruddin Hoxha accomplished. I think the deus ex machina here, which I've referred to already, is regime weakness, because if we're paying attention to the economic course, I think it's the Syrian pound now down to 1,300 per dollar, despite some real machinations on part of some regional players to prop it up. The Lebanese banking system is in dire straits, and that has direct impacts on the regime. So a regime like this one has some insulation. It can suffer a lot in terms of what its people suffer through and still stay on its feet, but the costs are mounting for its sponsors, and I think that's significant. Now, Idlib was a hard target for the regime even before February and March, and it remains that. We should remember that in '82, after the fighting in Hama with Hafez al-Assad, well before Bashar's time, they were still fighting in Idlib in 1985. So, I mean, resistance in Idlib will go on there, even the parts that, and we, frankly, even outside of Idlib in the southwest in Daraa, we see that the regime is incapable of pacifying and stabilizing the areas that it controls, or in theory. So it is even more in Idlib the case that it's a hard target now. The Turkish military has pumped in 10, 15,000, maybe more divisions worth of troops there. It's got hardened positions. It's got air defense systems. And what was achieved in late February and early March, I think, was done on a pretty austere military footprint, and the capabilities there are much stronger now. And so I think I see zero chance that the regime will actually be able to drive Turkey off these lands. And as you pointed out, Şaban, the Turks have a red line there that they are capable of enforcing. In terms of what the US did, the truth is, because of a number of factors, including S-400 and others, there are some complications in how much direct support can be provided. The good news is Turkey doesn't actually need a lot of direct support from the US or NATO in Idlib. I think of it in terms of escalation ladder. Turkey needed to know that if Russia moved up the escalation ladder to punish Turkey for its path in Idlib, that NATO would respond as NATO should, as a defensive alliance. And if there were attacks on Turkish territory, that NATO would come to the defense of Turkey. There was a strong rhetorical and diplomatic commitment. My boss, Ambassador Jeffrey, went to Syria and to southern Turkey in late February, early March. There were strong statements of support, and there were NATO consultations about what can be done. The practical requests from the Turkish side were very limited. And I don't think there's been a lot given, but there's not been a lot directly asked. It's probably not fully satisfying. I think there would have been, large shows of force or large shows of assistance that probably could have been very useful for a number of reasons that wasn't really asked for and it wasn't really given. But I think that it's important that Turkey knew at the senior levels and that the Russians knew at senior levels that Turkey was not alone. And I think that was communicated in the right ways. It appears to us that the Russians are kind of counseling restraint to Assad now. We don't know for sure, but Shoigu went to Damascus in March, and the dog that didn't bark, there was not a resumption of hostilities after that. So I think we infer from that it's possible the Russians are telling the Syrians this is not the time for this fight, and we suspect that will remain the case for the time being. There's huge humanitarian needs in Idlib. This is where it does cross over into the COVID crisis. There's no way that Syrians are not also suffering from this. The U.S. has appropriated some new funds both for Northeast and Northwest Syria. And I want to make this point as well. Even in regime-held territory, there is no sanction or no blockade on medical supplies. The U.S. supports, both through the UN and through other multilateral means, humanitarian assistance throughout Syria. And we try to make sure that doesn't get instrumentalized by the Assad regime. But in fact, there is no medical or humanitarian assistance blockade, and we are increasing funding for it in light of COVID. And we need to look at more ways to do that. Turkey, I think the Foreign Minister Çavuşoğlu came out this week and said Turkey favors a comprehensive, nationwide ceasefire in Syria. We do too. And a number of regional conflicts, in light of what's going on and the human suffering from the illness, would benefit from such a ceasefire. And that's absolutely what we see. All of this sums up to there is no path for Assad to get a military victory in Idlib. Just like there is no path for him to get a military victory to the conflict overall. The only path out of this is negotiated compromise solution, which changes the relationship between the regime in Damascus and the people of Syria so that this does not play out again. We still think that pertains. This is 2254, constitutional reform and elections. And we think that's the only path out of this. The economic stress on the regime will only increase as the economic stress on its supporters also increases, even more so in light of the virus. So I just, in closing, will mention one more thing. It's worth watching Libya here. This is strange and complex and opaque linkages, but we know now that there are Syrians fighting on both sides of the Libyan war as well, both GNA supported by the Turkish-supported opposition that has traveled to Libya, and also reports of reconciled Syrian fighters being sent by Assad to support the Haftar forces. It's a different set of characters than those that are involved in the Syrian crisis in terms of international support, but there are some parallels, and it's a very messy regional situation right now. We need to find ways to better coordinate efforts between the US and Turkey, but we are roughly aligned in both of these things. We want the fighting and the siege of Tripoli to stop. We want the fighting and the siege of Idlib to stop, and to find a negotiated situation out of both of these. And frankly, there's huge upside potential for us to do more with Turkey. Thank you.
Rich, thank you very much. I mean, this is really great to have that perspective as well. And I think it complements very well, if not entirely on the same issues of what Şaban has said. I mean, there's a whole other piece of this that we can get into about where it could lead us in terms of, is there an opening for an improvement in US-Turkish relations based in some sense around the Syria situation over time or not? Similarly, you could ask questions about the relationship with Europe in this regard, and how the European perspective on the situation in Syria, how it's involved in Idlib. Of course, for Europe, it's so closely tied up with the refugee issue, which you do mention in the paper, Şaban, as something that was part of the Turkish calculus. Of course, this is understood in Europe, but not always seen in a positive way, as we understand. So anyway, with that as sort of background, it's good to have a European perspective as well. And Dorothée, let me turn to you to offer some thoughts.
Merci, Jan. So again, there is this very meritoire effort to trilateralize the relationship. But I think Europeans feel even more, left aside up to a certain point. Like as an analyst, I find the piece of Şaban extremely interesting, but it deals a lot with the military issues. And we see that the Europe as a political entity, if we don't rely on the member states, namely France, the UK, that is presently very much blocked by both Brexit, coronavirus, etc. So let's say we have France and Germany who would come together and work on a political diplomatic solution, etc. But when it comes to military issues, so far, we had very little to say about what's happening in northwest of Syria. And also the divisions in the Western camp, I think, are blatant on so many issues, and the multilateral circles that we used to interact in are very inactive currently. So the only thing I see putting us together again to have a global perspective, if I say the US and the EU, is maybe that arguably with the countries who suffer more for the COVID-19 crisis currently. So that's not a very promising perspective. So the comments I wanted to make from a European point of view were first as an introduction that I think the EU has a very specific solidarity challenge with Turkey, because it does not work on the same level as it works with the US. Of course, as you said, there's the refugee issue that's on the table. That's very important. But don't forget that we still have the accession story in the background. We have the modernization of the customs union that we've been working on, strangely enough, last year with the German colleagues. And I think the accession process is now, it's not dead. We see regularly the Turks claiming that that accession is still a strategic objective for Turkey, strategic goal. But currently it poses very important challenges, of course, in terms of shared political values, but also external policies. And now with the COVID-19 crisis, we have to think on the economic future of the region. And this goes in the other direction, like we have to think about re-regionalizing the supply chains. We have to think about getting a rapprochement and maybe more integration between Turkey and the EU, again, economically. And what we see is Turkey has is tempted to reach out more to China currently because its economy is in a very bad shape and they need more money, etc. So I think here there's an opportunity that we should work together more on the economic perspective with Turkey for the future, even if everybody's probably remained broke after this COVID crisis. So we have the accession process, then we have the refugee crisis. We have we really wonder whether the deal between Turkey and Europe is still alive. If it's a fair agreement, what we hear from the Turks is that they feel disadvantaged and that they think the EU's been playing on Turkish spontaneous generosity and capacity to accommodate the presence of Syrians, and that they cannot do it anymore. So what we see is that the refugee deal does not satisfy either sides currently. And then there's a third level, which is NATO, because I think the EU is playing differently currently, or EU member states are playing differently than the US inside NATO currently. In the growing rift that we see between Turkey and the Western allies, we are sort of spectators of the great fight between the US and Turkey. We are quite inactive because of course we don't have the same military capabilities, but still there are constant calls for solidarity coming from Turkey on the Syrian crisis. And the impression we have is that Turkey actually has been devising its own strategy on Syria, never asking for anybody's acceptance or anybody sharing Turkish objectives, which remain actually quite hazy still. So that's my second point is, of course, we need to get closer to Turkey because we have all these specific solidarity challenges that I try to lay out with Turkey as Europeans. But then if we're honest and try to understand how to help Turkey in getting out of this deadlock in Syria, of course, the first question that comes into mind, even if it's very useless to try to bear the responsibility on one or the other side, but it's like we have to understand that in Europe, everybody has a feeling that Turkey is entirely responsible for its own difficult situation in Syria, and that we don't really understand the real goals and strategy of Turkey. Because even in Şaban's piece, I thought when he was mentioning that there were changing of the strategic mindsets and the main parameters driving the military strategy of Turkey, we cannot follow entirely the sinuosity of the Turkish approach and the way the Turks consider the Syrian crisis, because we think that it has to do very much with the combination of strictly Turkish national interests. The Kurdish issue is one. The idea that the Turks have been actually forced in some way by the Russians to handle the radical groups in Idlib also has to do with the own Turkey's playing with these radical groups beforehand, and the fact that in fact Russia wanted Turkey to acknowledge that they had a responsibility in the flourishing of this group within Syria, and to make Turkey responsible politically of what had happened in the activation of those groups and the supporting of those groups inside Syria. And there we had this background resentment from the West and especially Europeans vis-à-vis Turkey's ambivalence on the jihadi groups in Syria. So the second problem is that we don't really understand Turkey's real goal and strategies. We're not sure that they're compatible with the West needs. But then the second problem is that we have a feeling that the Turks have been running ahead for long in Syria, that they've been so quickly. We're always running behind, and we have to accommodate every new Turkish move. And we've been asked either to support it or to at least accept it, or we have sidelined at times because the Turks get so close to the Russians that, of course, the Europeans feel totally cornered, if you want, in a way. So we have this problem with Turkey being, as I said, running ahead for so long in Syria. I think about the ambivalence of the strategy, there's a very important point about the military situation in Idlib. I still don't understand from Şaban's pieces whether Turkey is actually buying time in the idea that there will be a military escalation once the COVID-19 crisis is over, once the ceasefire doesn't hold, or if they're really reaching out to the West to find new diplomatic solutions and to trying to rebalance between Russia and the West. And that brings a third question. Do we really think that we can be alternative partners for Turkey now? Is the West really an alternative partner for Turkey? Are the Europeans protagonists that have any importance in the current situation? We see that Turkey, even if they tries to reach out to the West, cannot for a series of very good reasons, because I think the US administration and diplomacy currently has very little credit, also because of the developments on the COVID-19 front. They're quite blocked because of the election campaign as well. The EU politically is currently totally deactivated, obsessed by our internal. Actually, it's helpful multiple crises to offer opportunities. We were thinking the Middle East, whether the pandemic therefore or on the contrary, completely calm down the conflict. On the two for the
Dorothée, it's become rather difficult to hear you. It might be that you get better bandwidth if you turn off your video, reluctantly, I say, but I don't know if others are having that same experience. Yeah. Okay.
Sorry.
It's better.
Sorry, I'm sorry. I was disconnected. That's confinement, you know.
It's a metaphor. It's a metaphor for our whole conversation.
Exactly. So on the two military fronts where the Turks are engaged, what we see is more escalation than calming down of the conflicts, both in Libya and in Syria. On the diplomatic level, does COVID crisis offer opportunities? What we see is a very active effort from the Turks to show their goodwill and to try and send some medical help to many countries, including in the EU, to actually improve their image. But it doesn't work fully because many incidents take place, and we don't really know if this effort to sort of ameliorate Turkey's public image is going to work on the long run. But what we see is that it changes the climate, at least at the political level between the EU and Turkey and some member states in Turkey. At the humanitarian level, of course, the COVID-19 crisis is just adding to the urgency. And I think we're totally underestimating the potential catastrophe that we could have among the refugee and displaced persons in the region. At the political level, finally, the COVID-19 crisis is clearly putting many regimes under stress, and I'm quite actually curious to follow the developments on some on institutions of some of the regimes in the region. Lebanon was mentioned, but I think, of course, Syria is a case in point. But what we see in Iran is that so far, the most conservative part of the regime has actually been more consolidated than weakened by the difficulty to manage the crisis. So nobody can necessarily expect the regimes to engage in more diplomatic efforts in the future, because on the contrary, there might be a clear radicalization of some of the regime. And to end, I would like to stress again that I think for the Europeans, the major difficulty currently, and at the same time the major challenge, because they have to engage more directly with Turkey in a very difficult relationship with Turkey, is the absence of leadership of the US. Not only on Syria, but globally. And literally, you know, we are thinking the new fashion in thinking about the COVID-19 crisis, to say it's the first post-American world crisis that we're facing, and that Washington doesn't matter anymore, that you should never look for a solution in the West on the American side. I think this is going clearly too far, but I think having at the same time to cope with an extremely difficult political relationship with Washington and with Ankara makes only, I think at the EU level, the Franco-German couple become stronger. And it's one point that's pushing France and Germany to work together more on the Middle East, not only on Turkey, but on the Middle East at large. That's it.
Dorothée, thank you very much. You know, you raised so many interesting questions. I think some of them we'll have to have you back to talk about it on, you know, when we talk more directly about the COVID issue in a transatlantic context. President Macron had a rather extraordinary interview in the Financial Times today, where he wasn't talking about Turkey, but you know, there were clearly messages in there that have real implications for the sort of things that we're talking about. I mean, it was basically a very strong, you know, point about the looming disaster for Europe if it doesn't get its act together about this crisis as Europe. But the point that you made about what that may mean for Europe's neighborhood and the need to somehow reinvent these relationships is a very strong one. I'd like to come back to this question with all of you of, you know, how this crisis, this COVID crisis, and the immense distraction that it is, how that complicates the task of sorting through some of these already very difficult questions in the relationship with Turkey, including, of course, Syria. I had a couple of things I wanted to throw at all of you, and I'm going to get to some of the questions that have come in online, but maybe I could go back, Şaban, to you first, because I had a question that I wanted to ask you about Turkish public opinion in relation to this crisis. Because there is an argument to be made that some of the forcefulness of Turkish policy on the ground in Syria was an outgrowth of a very heated nationalist environment and a very heated security conscious environment, which had been set up in terms of counterterrorism and so on for some time, actually, before the intervention, for very real and understandable reasons. But how is Turkish public sentiment viewing this now? Have people lost patience with it? Do they continue to be supportive? Are they completely distracted? How do you see it? And if you could unmute.
Am I back on the screen?
Perfect.
Okay. I was trying to pull one of the recent polls conducted by Turkey Rapport to see if they have a question on that. If you give me a few,
or even simply, you know, there was your own impressions, simply from the media.
I mean, regarding the public opinion dimension of the overall Syria policy, this new strategic culture definitely is shared by a big part of the population. So this is the new narrative in the domestic politics as well. The securitization of the foreign policy is going hand in hand with the domestic securitization since 2015, roughly. So that's definitely there. And then the way such foreign military engagements are justified domestically adds to the domestic support, in the sense that the external operations since 2016, they are framed broadly as extensions of Turkey's counterterrorism. So Turkey's struggle with PKK and other terrorist groups. So foreign interventions, foreign military use of force is seen as extension, natural extension of Turkey's domestic counterterrorism experience. So in that respect, I think overall the people did buy it. So there is a big support. There was a big support, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it can be directly translated into electoral outcomes. So we have seen it in the previous polls after the previous operations, in the sense that the polls around the time of the operation showed that people do support the operation and the policy, and the support for the governing coalition also increases. But after a while, the support for the governing coalition goes down. So there is a repetitive pattern there as well. But in the current operation, there is a different angle. As I said, this was different from the previous military engagements. This is the first time that Turkey is directly targeting the Syrian regime and the affiliated Shia militia forces. That makes a difference. So previously, it was much easier to justify it in terms of an extension of a kind of counterterrorism struggle. But in the current one, directly targeting the Syrian regime forces on the ground, the risk of direct interstate war, I think it did lessen the support. And I have, in the conversations with other observers, I have seen that the support is not similar to the previous ones, because it is not easy to justify in the same way as it used to be in the context of counterterrorism.
And the sensitivity to casualties? Evident?
It is big. Actually, I think the infamous night, 27th February, after which, as you know, the military operation was also declared self-standing. The big number of casualties on that night previously afterwards, I think it did create a kind of rally around the flag effect. So it did eliminate the internal criticism toward the operation. So if there were lower casualties, I would argue that there might have been a bigger criticism toward the operation per se, the military engagement per se. But the casualties, sort of even very opposition figures, those figures like E-Party who were critical of the rationale, the logic of supporting Idlib, they said we are right to retaliate. So it did create a kind of rally around the flag effect, and it undermined the potential criticism because, as I said, targeting the regime doesn't go with the previous pattern of counterterrorism. So there is bigger criticism potential inside.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. We've accumulated a lot of questions actually from our audience, but just before we go to them, let me very briefly, if I could, for you, Rich and Dorothée, two questions. One, Rich, does the US, do you feel that you've got a decent enough insight into Turkish plans and strategy in this regard? I mean, were we surprised by what Turkey has done at multiple points here? Are we likely to be surprised in the future? Do we talk to the Turks in a way that is revealing to us of what to expect?
Yes, I think we do. We've got not only a very gifted ambassador, David Satterfield in Ankara, who has very good access and very close contact with Turkish counterparts. Ambassador Jeffrey also has frequent conversations, both with Deputy Foreign Minister Onal and with Ambassador Ünal, who is the Syria envoy in the MFA. Military to military contacts remain very tight. I would say that we are very well informed about Turkish the sort of anticipations, concerns, how they see things playing out. We can't predict any better than anyone else about how well they're going to do. I think, for instance, the great effect that they achieved with the unmanned aerial vehicles in Idlib was a bit of a surprise to us, as it was to most people. But we've thought for a long time with regards to Idlib, and frankly, the Turks are not mysterious on things. Before Euphrates Shield, before Olive Branch, before Peace Spring, long discussions, fairly good detailed understanding on our side about where the differences were between us and where we could minimize differences and help. So I feel like that on that part of it, we're doing okay.
Rich, thank you very much. Dorothée, just going back to some of the points that you made and things you've heard, where do you see the biggest risks here? Talked about some of the opportunities actually, but what could seriously go wrong here that would be truly meaningful in terms of the regional order, in terms of Turkish-Western relations, relationship with Russia? I mean, there's a lot of concern that there are groups operating with rules of engagement that aren't particularly clear or transparent, and the potential for something to go wrong is clearly there. NATO worries about this clearly. What do you worry about if you were to pick one thing to mention to us? And if you could unmute.
I suppose for the EU, two main issues on the table. One is the risk of a breach of the ceasefire and direct confrontation between the Turkish army and the Syrian one. And clearly, my take from the beginning of the Syrian crisis was that Bashar would like to take his revenge from Erdoğan anyway, because there's an accumulation of resentment for long, and that I don't think anybody's going to forget what happened in the past. We should not forget that Turkey was the #1 supporter of the Syrian opposition from the very start of the crisis, and it was the most fierce opponent and, let's say, enemy of Bashar al-Assad for very long. And now that Bashar has recovered 2/3 of his territory and wants to organize a full political restoration, I'm very curious about the relationship that can be arranged at political level even after the end of the war between the two countries, because I don't think the relationship between the two leaders will ever be that good. And the second point, of course, for the EU is the question of the refugees, but that let me again add a sort of a subtitle to what I said about the Syrian refugee crisis and the deal with the EU. What we see is that the latest wave of people who wanted to move to the EU from Turkey were like 80% of them were not Syrians. So it has to do with the Syrian crisis, but not only. It has to do definitely with Turkey's wanting to put pressure on the EU to internationalize the crisis and to get a response on some other fronts. And Cyprus is another issue that could escalate between the EU and Turkey strategically. So we have many hot points currently strategically between the EU and Turkey that Turkey would like actually to address in a package, because it thinks that Turkey thinks that it can bring the EU to support, actually to rally to its, I think, national vision of the regional crisis at large. And it's simply impossible for the EU to rally about the Turkish national view of the future of the region, because we are not a single entity. We have differing problems. We have the Brexit on the one hand, we have the extreme right rising somewhere, we have countries that have difficulties putting together governments, we have the COVID-19 crisis at a very high stage of inorganization and difficulty to cope on a daily basis with the number of deaths, etc. So I think it's very ineffective to think that the EU can come together with a whole united strategic vision of what's a problem for Turkey regionally.
Okay, thank you very much. We've accumulated a lot of questions. We'll see how many we get to. Some people have asked multiple ones, but we'll try maybe to shift around and pick pick different people with their individual questions. And for this, I'm actually going to turn to my colleague, Ceylan Canbilek in Ankara, who has very kindly offered to sort of manage this part of the agenda for us. So Ceylan, over to you.
Thank you, Ian. It's a pleasure to be on this side of the screen and help out with the questions and comments. And the first question is from Menekşe Tokyay, and it follows as: the reopening of the M4 highway in Idlib remains a huge challenge for Turkey, which has to remove jihadi groups from the area. As HTS doesn't accept any deal between Russia and Turkey about Idlib, how Turkey can pacify HTS and prevent it from challenging to the already fragile balances in the region? Or will Ankara burn all the bridges with the HTS and start fighting them to secure the M4?
Okay, well, I think, clearly this is something, Şaban, we would like your view on, and Rich, feel free to, or Dorothée, feel free to chime in. Quite briefly, if I could ask you, because we have a lot of people we're trying to get to.
Yeah, thank you for the question. This was part of the 6+6 corridor, south and north of the motorway. Technically, yesterday, the Russian and Turkish units tried to conduct the fourth joint patrol, but again, it was blocked by the civilians protesting. And quite a big number of the civilians seem to be locals, but there are also apparently some HTS or other guys who are sort of provoking the civilians. So the Turkish side believes that the civilian protests are to some extent provoked by these radical groups. So the patrols so far could not be completed. So they start because of the protest after 2-3 kilometers, they cannot continue their mission. So there is a pattern. So in the recent one, what we have seen, Turkey dispatched some riot police kind of forces to disperse the civilians protesting. To me, it shows that, as I indicated in the paper and earlier, increasingly Turkey is getting ready to confront these groups by force, because the military muscle that is put on the ground in Idlib is there to deter all other factions. So in the meantime, we shouldn't also forget that the military balance on the ground in Idlib is also transforming. So in that sense, Richard is right. So it's a mission impossible, but in the meantime, Turkey is also accomplishing certain things. The nature of the problem is also transforming. So the HTS is not the HTS of 1 year ago in terms of the actual control on the ground. Plus, Syrian National Army, the other military group supported by Turkey, they were also deployed in Idlib for the first time during the recent crisis. So the balance of power is shifting away from HTS. I think Turkey has some dominance, but despite that, Turkey is not interested in directly targeting them to create a huge havoc in the region. Wants to manage the problem over time. So probably increasing the pressure on HTS so that they will see that at one point dissolving might be a better option for the HTS. This is the kind of best case scenario. But in the meantime, in addition to the militarily confronting and limiting the scope of HTS, undercutting its political control and also sources of economic revenue, especially their control over the borders, so on and so forth. I think these are parts of Turkey's tactics and strategy at this stage to increasingly erode the power and grip of HTS there. But as I see it, they are not interested in leaving anytime soon. So it won't be an easy task again. And Mission Impossible episode 5, 6. So that's the gist of the Mission Impossible analogy. So it keeps going on. There's always a new redefined mission. That's the nature of the challenge there.
Rich, do you want to quickly on that one from your appreciation?
With the Turkish approach to to counterterrorism, certainly with regards to radical jihadist terrorism, has always been a little bit different. I don't want to say subtle. I don't want to be either pejorative or too praiseworthy here, but we have a very kinetic approach in the U.S. HTS is a group with clear and long-standing AQ ties. We tend to think of it as a target set in the kinetic sense, and that accords with how we typically handle these types of situations. Turkey's more proximate to the problem, and of course HTS is not. It's not entirely monolithic. It's gone through some changes, I think. And maybe I'll preempt one of the other questions that I saw in the queue here about my boss's previous discussions about this. There is a theory of HTS and how we get to resolution of HTS as a terrorist problem set. A Turkish theory to that, which is that you can sort of disaggregate it. That HTS itself consists of some people who are more focused on Syria, frankly. They're not international jihadists. There are people who are dedicated to the fight against Assad, and they're also jihadists, or at least they have that tendency. The idea that politically some of these people can be convinced that they should join a Syrian national cause and not fight for some sort of a caliphal type or religiously dominated government, but to live with other Syrian nationalists and patriots, is a theory worth trying. That's been Turkey's position on this. And if you think of it as sort of a horizontal line, there's parts of that line before you get to the truly, rotten head-cutting jihadist people who want to do external operations and so forth, that there are people who maybe have motives and modus operandi that are compatible with other Syrian oppositionists. Turkey's trying that. Turkey's, I think, trying to get some of those people, and if I understand the Turkish endgame in this, it is to get to the point where HTS is basically the elements of HTS renounce all links with international terrorism, external operations, and so forth, and try to become former terrorists that are fighting in the Syrian national cause. That's different from how the US views it. I mean, obviously we have very low tolerance for AQ affiliation because of our concerns about this. And there's some tension between the two approaches. I think Turkey, as Şaban said, doesn't want to directly go after these folks. They want to split the stone one drop at a time. We'll see how it turns out. The balance of power has turned against HTS. They've lost a big part of what they formerly controlled of the regime. And as we can tell by looking at a map, the presence of 10 to 15,000 Turkish soldiers and some Syrian national army means HTS was not what it was. And that may leave the door open for these people that are reconcilable within that movement to ultimately become something else. This is similar to, I think, what my boss has said, and I don't remember the specific quote, but Ambassador Jeffrey has mentioned that there has been signaling from sources within HTS, and who knows, maybe it's disingenuous, maybe some of it's tactical, but we should remember that not every terrorist organization so designated ends in the complete and utter obliteration of the terrorist organization. In some cases, they are convinced to give up international terrorism or what we would consider terroristic acts. And I think we've seen some of that signaling out of folks that are either in or closely sort of on the margins of HTS. And I think the boss understands, my boss, that is, Ambassador Jeffrey, understands that is a tack that Turkey has held out some hope for, and we're watching. We're not convinced it won't work.
Rich, thanks for that, and thanks also for picking up on one of the questions that was directly about that, about Ambassador Jeffrey's recent comments. Ceylan, back to you.
Sure. There are two questions about the COVID-19 situation, and one is from Christina Beich. How is the Turkish government preparing for the possibility of the COVID-19 virus spreading in the zones under its control in Syria? And the other one is from Serkan Demirtaş, and it's specifically directed to Dorothée. How do you think the COVID-19 would have an effect on Turkey-EU dialogue?
Okay, so on the first one in Syria, I mean, Şaban, feel free to make a brief comment, and on the second one directly to you, Dorothée, on the European side, you could pick up on that. So Şaban, please.
As I understand now, there are protocols since March about the troops going in and out. The quarantine procedures are observed very carefully. As I understand, there is not a reporting of a major outbreak in the zone where the Turkish troops are also stationed. And we have seen rather reports about some of the cases reported among the regime, especially militia fighters. But there are protocols, as I understand, but it is not a huge outbreak at this stage based on the open source I have come across to.
Dorothée.
So first, I wanted myself to ask a question following on what you've been discussing, both Şaban and Recep, on the managing of HTS, because from discussions I had with Russian analysts, I see that clearly the ideal strategy for Russia would be eradication, and they hope very much that Turkey at some point would actually rally to that idea and to that philosophy of treating the strongest, the kernel of the terrorist organization there by this eradication strategy. And I wonder, because I think there were hints at that within Şaban's piece, but I was wondering whether Turkey had concerns for its internal security if it went on a more a higher level of confrontation with the hard part of the HTS community. So that was one point. Then on the effects of COVID-19 on Turkey-EU dialogue, I think yesterday, probably some of you listened to Ibrahim Scalen's brief organized by ECFR, where he started with designing the ground picture of the post-COVID-19 world. And basically, I think his take is that there's a sort of equalization going on. Like we all have the same difficulties, so it makes us humble. And I think it's very interesting to see that officially Turkey is searching for this style of relationship now with the EU, that it's been flexing its muscles and playing the relation of force and the balance of power and showing that it was super strong. And now the idea is that, okay, we know we're all weak. And in the end, I think the Turks know that by many aspects, their economy is weak. They're left alone in Syria. They have a very bad relationship with the United States. That is their primary ally historically and for all sorts of reasons. The relationship with Russia is becoming more tense. So I think they have a very important stake there to get closer to the EU and to, let's say, civilianize, if you want, the relationship with the EU. So I think this is what's going to happen is probably a political dialogue, a smoother political dialogue in the post-COVID-19 crisis. But still, I have to insist that Cyprus is the next big problem in sight in the region with the EU.
Mike is off.
I'm going to follow my own advice and unmute. Ceylan, back to you for the list.
Mm-hmm. We have a couple of questions regarding how the Syrian policy is governed in Turkey, and one of them is from Kemal Kirişçi. It follows as how much of Şaban's domino theory to explain why Turkey did what it did in his interpretation as an expert, and how much of it is based on actual discussion debates within the government. And the next one is from Daphne McCurdy. Who in the Turkish government is directing Turkey's policy in Syria? Are there tensions between different ministries or personalities?
Okay, so who's in charge and what do they really think?
It's not me, I can tell you for sure. To Dorothée, regarding the domestic situation in terms of counterterrorism, countering HTS. So we have been there before. I mean, confronting the HTS is not a new topic for Turkey since 2017, 18, even earlier when it was Nusra Front. I mean, from time to time, Americans did provide intelligence for striking some of their positions or personnel. So the cooperation was there, targeting them in Syria was there. So in many of the critical points, especially in 2018, 19, when Turkey was escalating the policy rhetoric towards HTS, we have seen a lot of domestic counterterrorism operations, raids to potential sympathizers or the potential support networks inside Turkey. So, I mean, there's definitely a domestic angle to countering HTS and potential affiliated groups that may be in sleeping cells and so on and so forth in Turkey. So it goes not only external, but also internally, countering HTS and other radicals. So regarding Kemal Hoca's question, I mean, my reading of the situation is based on the people who read the government better than me. So I think it does reflect, I cannot tell for sure whether what was going on when the ministers and officers were discussing in their rooms, but I think it does reflect part of what was in their thinking and conversations based on my reading of other people, as well as talking to other people that have an insight into what's going on. So regarding who makes the policy, I think there are a couple of actors here as part of the broader transformation of Turkish political system. The presidency is definitely there as part of this presidential foreign policy model, which has been in place. Executive presidency, that's definitely the main institution shaping the policy, but the input and execution, I mean, let's face it, for Turkey, the Syria engagement for a while initially was more of a kind of intelligence, covert operation kind of challenge. So remember, American policy also went through different phases. CIA had its own, the Defense Department had its own Syria policy, worked with different guys, supported different guys, they fought each other, the American arms on opposite sides of the conflict. But for Turkey overall, initially it was more of kind of counter intelligence and covert operation kind, but increasingly we see the use of the regular military forces since 2016 through the military operation. So it gives a bigger leverage to the military in shaping the policy. Definitely there is a transformation, but still there is another question with the new transition when we say the military, who speaks for the military? Is it the minister or the chief of staff? But given the position of the current minister, his background, of course, he's also an influential player in addition to the intelligence and the presidential office.
Okay, thanks very much. Ceylan.
So we have barely enough time for the remainder of the questions. So I think it's better we keep we limit the questions to the existing ones. And the next two of them are about the operations, military side. One is from Ömer Özkızılcık. Turkey can deal with the Assad regime and Shia militias, but what about the Russian Air Force and air superiority? Is there a realistic way to overcome this by a joint Turkish-American approach? And the next one is from Jasper Mortimer. All the experts say Turkey's military force in Idlib is now far stronger than the Syrian government military. Why then did Turkey fail to push the Syrian government army back to the Sochi boundaries? In its push against the Syrian government army in February, the Turkish-backed forces even failed to hold Sarakep. If the Turkish-backed forces had held Sarakep, it would have put Turkey in a much stronger position vis-a-vis Moscow and Damascus. One is surprised that Turkey failed to capitalize on its military advantage.
Okay, thanks. Maybe briefly for, well, anyone who wants to pick up on it, but certainly for Şaban and maybe Rich, you might have a thought. What you
I can jump in and Rich may comment more on the US angle. Regarding the air superiority, this is the critical component about the Russian involvement, because as we know, Russia has been providing intensive close air support to the regime in other theaters as well. So what happened in the meantime during the course of the recent crisis in the last 2 months or so, Turkey did deploy some air defense capabilities, but I think they are able to deter the regime air force, the helicopters and other fighter, but Russian Air Force flying high altitude I guess they are beyond Turkey's ability to deter fully. So this is where I leave it to Richard. He can discuss it in more detail. But about the second question, the Sarakip, fall of Sarakip, the Turkish deterrent vis-a-vis the regime, the balance of power. But we have to have a kind of dynamic analysis here. So back in January, we didn't have the same forces on the ground. So February, March, escalation, deployment. So we now have a new situation. So back in February, early March, in February when Sarakip fell, as I said, it was a game changer. It ran against the narrative which Richard also outlined. This is where I am kind of skeptical about the regime weakness theory, in the sense that we all assumed that regime was weak, the regime would not find it easier to advance, but suddenly fall of Sarakip in haste, creating a kind of chaotic scenario. The regime weakness theory didn't work because what happened in the meantime, additional deployment of the Shia militia, which we were not expecting, Iran-backed forces, Hezbollah was very active. It changed the balance. So my response in the fall of the Sarakip, the current Turkish military muscle was not there. We should make this distinction. At that particular time, the Turkish military involvement in Idlib was only about the observation missions. The current reality is different. Pushing further back after the military deployment, increasing the Turkish military presence could have been an option, but it would have necessitated a bigger confrontation with Russia. I think Turkey didn't want to see that.
Rich?
So I think regime weakness vis-a-vis the opposition, that theory failed. But that what you pointed out, Şaban, I agree with, is that the reason the regime was able to launch something substantive in January, February was because of the Shia militias and because of the Iranians. This is actually an indicator of weakness rather than strength. They're depending on the foreign escalation on their behalf. And then when the Turks counter-escalated, that's when the offensive stopped. So I think the regime is back now that the Turks have substantively reinforced their positions in Idlib. The regime, even with its Shia militia allies, is now in the inferior position. So that said, they do have a problem with the Russian Air Force. And on that, you know, by the way, the Syrian Arab Air Force is not a substantial force. They don't have that many great planes left. Some of their wonderful barrel bombing helicopters were destroyed and had to be pulled back from the lines. You may have noticed in the latter stages of the campaign, no barrel bombing in Idlib. They had I think it was a L-39. They had a training aircraft that was shot down by Turkish air defense as it was bombing. You don't bomb with a training aircraft unless you're out of the good ones. So I think they're scraping the bottom of the barrel on the Syrian Air Force itself. Now you have a different problem with the Russians. They have, I think, a total of about 40 aircraft in Syria. Turkey has, what, close to 200 F-16s? And by the way, this is beyond my mandate as a strategist or as a advisor to the State Department on Turkey and Syria and U.S. relations. But as
an artillery officer,
as an artillery officer, here's how I would do it if I was Turkey. My theory of the case would be this: you send in as many man-portable air defense systems, Stingers and things like Stingers, with your forces and with the Syrian opposition into Idlib. You make the low-flying aircraft at danger. You bring in the improved Hawks and the Hisar and the other air defense systems that Turkey already has, and you make it more difficult at the medium level so that the Russians, if they're going to shoot anything, are going to shoot from a very high altitude using very precious, which they don't have many of, the precision-guided munitions. And then you communicate very clearly to the Russians that you don't want to shoot down any Russian aircraft, you don't want any untoward events, but you will protect your forces on the ground, and that you will not have a repeat of what happened when the Turkish forces who were stopped and got PGM'd by the Russians back in February when that happened. And then you fly an aggressive combat air patrol of dozens of F-16s in Turkish airspace in that area, making it very clear that you are ready to shoot down a Russian plane if any of them attack Turkish forces on the ground. That's how Turkey can do that on its own. Now, I don't think the Russians are stupid enough or rash enough to attack Turkish airplanes over Turkish airspace. And I did see that was one of the questions in the line there. That would be a legitimate trigger to NATO Article 5 discussions. There's generally been a disinclination among NATO experts to support military operations or defensive military forces beyond the NATO frontiers, so to speak. And Turkey's border is the Turkey-NATO frontier. So there's a real question about how NATO would respond to a major, say, Russia-Turkey conflict south of that border. And I'm not confident that that conversation would turn out the way that I would want it to. So I think Turkey has to make, plans based on more or less its own deterrence capabilities south of that line. But in the case of a rash miscalculation, I think NATO absolutely would do what NATO was designed to do, which is to protect Turkish and NATO airspace against violations and attacks into it.
Thanks very much. Jim, I'll go back to you, but I'm also conscious of our time, and so perhaps we could take one more, and then we can wrap up. So I'll give the choice to you, Ceylan.
I think that can be about the S-400s for rich Outzen. And how about, to what extent do you think a Turkish decision to activate the S-400s would deteriorate the bilateral ties?
Yeah, and thanks for, I think it was Serkan who put that question in there. So S-400, of course, is a bilateral issue that transcends the Syria portfolio. It is already a massive problem. It's a massive problem for technical reasons that have to do with the S-400 and its radar and the impact that has onto aircraft flying around it. That's why Turkey is out of the F-35 program right now. So I would say there are people that argue it's already been activated, right? Because the radar was turned on and tracked some aircraft in that airspace. It is a significant but somewhat muffled bilateral problem. It's muffled right now because of COVID. But the thinking in Washington prior to COVID dominating discourse was that that the Turks were probably going to activate the full system in April, and that Congress was then again moved to impose sanctions. I don't think any of that's gone away. Kay Bailey Hutchison, our ambassador to NATO, has been quoted as saying a lot of things get solved, including much more open hands for what we can do to help with regards to Idlib if a solution is found on S-400. And I think the conversations are continuing about what an appropriate solution looks like from the United States perspective. I haven't seen a lot of give on the Turkish side on this, so I think we haven't moved that problem. Activation would, to answer your question, would be a big problem. It's going to create a new crisis, and from an American perspective, for very justifiable reasons that go to the heart of how we operate as a defense alliance.
Okay, well, we are really at the end of our time. There are a lot of issues that we've raised. There are a lot of things that we'll certainly come back to in this On Turkey series and the On Turkey conversations, including, I suspect, the S-400 question and some of these bigger issues that Dorothée very thoughtfully raised about where Europe may be going, where the United States is going in terms of the overall relationship with Turkey. Let me thank all three of you for joining us. And making this conversation work. It's really been terrific. Şaban, thank you very much for the paper. Thank you very much for your remarks. Dorothée, thank you for joining us. Rich, thank you for taking the time and for being so open with us as well. We're really, really grateful. Let me thank again my colleagues in Ankara, Ceylan, for being part of this conversation as well, but also Özgür for his fantastic direction of this whole project in the office. We're all under, difficult conditions here, but we try to do what we can virtually. So thank you for that. And finally, thanks to my colleague, John Alexander in Washington, who helped put all of this together. And above all, thanks to all of you who've joined us. I think we had about 70 odd people at one point in the conversation, and that's really, really splendid at a time when nobody really wants to talk about anything but COVID. So thank you. Hope to see you again soon. Good afternoon. Good morning. All the best.